Hi there, welcome to this lecture looking at the effect of processes in schools on achievement. This one's going to focus on the processes of setting and the formation of subcultures. So processes in schools are the things that happen within a school building that might affect achievement. And we have studied a few of them already so far this year, and so hopefully these will be familiar to you. Labelling and the self-fulfilling prophecy that happens as a result of labelling. Teachers' expectations, like what do they expect of students and the effect that has on those students' performance in class and later on exams. The role of the hidden curriculum, so these are the things that you learn in school that aren't on the taught curriculum, the things that you are socialised into thinking, believing, how your values are passed on and norms. And this lecture is going to look at what's known as streaming or banding or setting, and then how that really does link to the formation of subcultures, the most harmful of those being the anti-school subculture. So here are some concepts for you to highlight or get down. If you've got the worksheet that I've provided for you, they'll be on there, so you can just highlight them. So concepts you need to be aware of. Setting. So this is when students are placed in a class based on their ability in that particular subject. So you might be in top set for French, middle set for maths, bottom set for science, for example. Streaming and banding isn't really used much anymore, perhaps possibly in some grammar schools, but just be aware of the concept. So streaming and banding is when students are placed into a stream of subjects, so multiple subjects, all at the same level based on ability. So you would be in top set for, French, English, maths, science, even if perhaps you weren't as able in French as you were in English, for example. So most secondary schools do set or stream pupils in subjects. It might be a bit of a mixture in some secondary schools. Some secondary schools might only do setting in English, math, science. Some secondary schools might do setting in more subjects than that. And it's a way of schools and teachers being able to teach to different ability groups. So on the one hand, it's great, because if you're a lower ability student, teachers can teach to your ability and support you in that way. But on the other hand, it's not so great if you are put into a set that is lower than your ability, so that can be a bit problematic. The reason it can be a bit problematic is that it does mean that some students sit different exams to others in certain subjects. So I know science, you have foundation science papers where the top level you can get is a 5 or what used to be a really high C. Or you might be put in for the higher science paper where you can get up to a 9, which is the equivalent, I guess, of like an A star. So by being put into a particular set, you are then quite often then entered in for either a higher or foundation paper, so top set's higher, bottom set's foundation, but it does have a real impact on your achievement levels, because if you're in that bottom set or one of the lower sets, the maximum you're able to get is a 5, which if you were capable of a 6, you don't get the opportunity to get. So what I'd like you to write down at this point is what signs might teachers use to label students as high or low ability when deciding sets. And yet, definitely, one of those signs is going to be test scores, but it's not the only thing. What other things or symbols, behaviours, do you think teachers look at in students to decide, I think that student is capable, let's put them in a higher set, or, oh no, I don't think that student can do it, I think it's better off we put them in a bottom set and enter them for foundation. What sorts of symbols and labels do teachers look for in order to decide which set a student should go to? So write down your ideas. I'm not going to give you that information. At this point, you should already be aware of the kind of things teachers use to label students, if you like, as high ability or low ability. So once you've got your ideas down, then let's move on with this lecture. So one of the key sociologists you need to be aware of when it comes to talk about setting is Stephen Ball. He argued that teacher labelling led to students being banded. He used the phrase banded, but all that means is being put into sets. But he said, this teacher labelling led to students being put into sets based on social class. So he said it was nothing to do with ability, it was about their class. And this was leading to mass failure for the working class. He was really concerned about it. So if you've got the handout I've given you, you'll see an extract from his research that we're going to read through now together. And I'd like to highlight some of the key information. You're going to use this study to answer the questions on the right-hand side of this slide, which are also on your worksheet if you've got it. I'll read through, and if you can please highlight and annotate as we go, that would be really awesome. So Stephen Ball's research is from 1981. It is quite some time ago now, 1981. So you could argue it's a bit out of date, but sets still exist today, like 40 years later. So I do think there's some validity in his research. So this was a classic study into secondary education, which investigated why working class pupils underperformed in school. Stephen Ball spent 3 years in Beachside Comprehensive School carrying out a study. That's a long time for this research, focusing on the impact of streaming. Now remember, he's using the phrase streaming. Streaming does mean that kind of idea of like being put into an ability group for all your subjects. Ball found that pupils who started school with similar pro-school attitudes then began to change when placed in a set or a stream. So I want you to highlight that. But when they started school, students tend to all be fairly pro-school. And I kind of agree with that. And I think year 7s quite often come in with really pro-school attitudes. But things do begin to change when they're placed in a set or a stream, according to Ball. Students in the top bands or sets were well-behaved, hard-working, and made progress. Whereas students in the lower band sets were poorly behaved, lazy, and further behind academically. So one of the questions I've asked you for number 2 is, how did the behaviour and attitudes in top and bottom set band differ? Well, top set, well-behaved, hard-working. Bottom set, poorly behaved and lazy. Now, Ball argued this wasn't because of the students themselves. He said it was because of the teacher labels that were applied because of the bands they'd been placed in. Those in top were labelled as bright, and they were treated in that way. And this led to them fulfilling that label. So that's the idea of the teacher expectations and how important positive teacher expectations are in actually becoming true. If you expect the student to do well, you're more warm, supportive, helpful towards them perhaps, and therefore they are more likely to do well. So they fulfill the label you've given them. Unfortunately, students in the lower bands were viewed as less able. So they were labelled as less able and they were treated that way. So my third question I've asked is, how do the students know they've been labelled? Well, they are given less challenging work, entered for low-tier exams, which I've already spoken to you about, and given dumbed-down resources. Okay, so they are genuinely treated differently. Whereas in higher sets, they're given more challenging work, they're given more praise, and they're entered in for higher exams. They've got a far better chance of doing well. So my final question I've asked you is, how did the self-fulfilling prophecy of the negative label become true? So look out for the answer to this. So Ball argued that working class pupils are more likely to be placed in lower sets, whereas middle class pupils are more likely to be placed in higher sets. Working class students then became increasingly disinterested in education, and they became anti-school. So they became deviant, they started rejecting school, whereas higher sets became increasingly pro-school. They valued it, they worked hard there. The effect of this is that the schools reproduce class inequalities. And Ball suggests that this creates what's known as downward social mobility because of self-fulfilling prophecies. So schools are basically bringing in middle-class students and working-class students, and they're popping out the same middle-class students and the same working-class students. They're not helping the working-class students do better. So this is something that Stephen Ball had a real problem with. So I want you to pause the slide at this point, and I want you to write in your answers to numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll carry on with the rest of the lecture. Okay, we'll move on at this point. So it's worth always remembering that setting is very closely connected to the formation of subcultures. So here are 2 more key concepts for this lecture. If you've got them on the worksheet, highlight them, or please write them down and highlight them. So a subculture is a small group within society with its own norms and values. There are lots and lots of different subcultures. Your peer group, for example, would arguably be a small subculture. However, an anti-school subculture is a small group of students who do not agree with the norms and values of the school. So they don't agree with the behaviours that are dominant in the school. They don't value the same things that people in school value. And instead they create their own, and often those norms and values are the opposite to the mainstream of the school. So on your worksheets or your notes, can you please note down why might some students create anti-school subcultures? What's the point? Now have a think about that. Like if you've been put into bottom set, you're probably feeling like a little bit rejected, you're feeling a bit angry, you might be upset, probably feeling a little bit, unwelcome, unwanted. But what can you gain from your anti-school subculture? What can you gain from your anti-school subculture that the school is not giving you? So why might some students create anti-school subcultures? Please, if you can write down your ideas at this point, that would be great. I'm not giving you the answer for this one. And once you've done that, we'll move on. So we've met this guy before. This is Hargreaves. And we looked at him in relation to labelling. So he argued that teachers make quick, speculative judgments of their pupils and their abilities. Now, can you remember what he said those judgments are based on? Okay, so if you think back, what did he say those judgments are based on? He said some of the things he talked about, and we talked about in class, were things like uniform, like how students wear their uniform. If they wear their uniform correctly, they're labelled more positively. Are students engaged in the lesson? Do they partake in the lesson? Things like how do they act and behave in class? Do they listen and respect the teachers? Or are they more interested in their friendship groups? So all of these kind of things that happen in a classroom, teachers use, according to Hargreaves, to make these judgments about whether a student is a good student or a bad student, which is labelling them as a good student or a bad student. And I guess one of the things that you need to be able to do is to connect the idea that this sort of labelling then obviously links to setting or streaming, because ultimately it is teachers that decide who goes into what set, who goes into what stream. Like I said, test scores will certainly form part of that decision making, and it does in many schools. But Hargreaves argued that too much of it was down to the subjective judgments of teachers. And unfortunately, lots of teachers were judging the good students, the able students, to be middle class, and the bad students and the not clever students to be working class. And the problem with that is, well, what do labels lead to? If you are given a positive label as a good student, as an ideal pupil, what will that then lead to if you're treated like you're a good student and an able student? And however, if you're labelled as a bad student, what is that going to lead to? If you feel like you are not welcome, if you feel like a teacher doesn't like you, if you feel like a teacher doesn't think you're able, are you going to try very hard in that lesson? Probably not. And ultimately, if you don't try hard in that lesson, you are therefore going to prove the teacher's label as correct. And this is what's known as the self-fulfilling prophecy, where you're given a label and you fulfill it, you become that label. So labels are really, really dangerous things, particularly if they're applied wrongly. So Hargreaves argued that when he looked at these boys, when he studied these boys in the classroom, and if they were a bit cheeky to the teachers, answered back, and they didn't do the homework, and they were a bit disruptive, he said actually this wasn't happening because these boys were naturally naughty. It happened because they'd been labelled. They literally reflected the expectations of the teacher. And the big problem, he argued, was that those in the lower streams then created these anti-school subcultures in response to this failure label. So they felt like failures, they were frustrated, they were angry, they were upset, they felt unwelcome. So they formed anti-school subcultures. So why do you think forming an anti-school subculture might make the boys feel better? What about it would make them feel better? Well, ultimately, they would gain belonging, wouldn't they? they could gain belonging from those peers because they would accept them as not being academic. And because anti-school subcultures have their own norms and values, they would then gain status from that peer group by being anti-school. They would have a sense of belonging. They would enjoy aspects of coming to school to hang out with their mates. School would become a social place, not a place for them to maybe academically succeed, but a place for them to feel popular and cool, perhaps among their friendship groups, by being quite anti-school and deviant. But ultimately, they would feel better because they would have status. Sorry. And Paul Willis is the final study I want us to talk about today. He agreed with Hargreaves, okay? He also studied anti-school subcultures. But he had a very different take on it. He did not think anti-school subcultures were caused by labelling. He believed that anti-school subcultures were formed because the boys, working class boys, made a choice never to believe in the myth of meritocracy. Okay, so he believed that they never bought into the myth of meritocracy. Remember, meritocracy is the idea that if you work hard, you'll be rewarded. And he said working class boys never bought into that. They never thought they'd do well in school. They didn't believe school was for them. So similar to the previous couple of slides, I'm going to read through some extracts from Paul Willis's research with you, and I'd like you to answer those questions on the right-hand side, okay? So I'll read through the questions first. What norms and values did the anti-school subcultures have? And then number 2, 3, and 4, explain how the study goes against the functionist view of education. So remember, functionists believe education is a key agent of secondary socialisation, passes on norms and values, teaches a shared value consensus. Number 3, explain how the study goes against the Marxist view of education, particularly the correspondence theory, Bowles and Gintis. And then number 4, I'm just asking you to summarise what does Paul Willis believe is the main cause of the subcultures, if he doesn't believe it's labelling. So let's read through it together, and if you've got a highlighter, please highlight these aspects of the study. So Paul Willis used overt, non-participant observations and unstructured interviews to understand education from a children's point of view. It might just be worth highlighting the research method that he used there. It's overt observation, so the participants knew he was studying them. So that kind of does mean that they might have changed their behaviour somewhat, okay? So just be aware of that. And unstructured interviews, which means they could have talked at length and in detail, which is quite a good, valid way of doing research. As a Marxist sociologist, he was interested in why working class students got working class jobs. But he reached different conclusions from the Marxist Bowles and Gintis. In case you've forgotten, they are the correspondence principle, Bowles and Gintis. They say that schools mirror work to create docile workers to benefit capitalism. Willis's study of working class boys focused on the lads, a group of 12 working class boys from Birmingham who were disruptive, misbehaved, and a negative attitude to education. Okay, so you've got a few norms there. They formed what Willis called an anti-school subculture. And within the subculture, it was cool to mess around and to fail. Some more norms there. From the perspective of these boys' subculture, students at that school viewed positively were ear-rolls or swats. And the last thing you wanted was praise from a teacher. So they did not value praise from teachers. Instead, the lads could get praise from their group for, a few more norms here, truancy, skiving, and bad behaviour and discriminatory attitudes. He found there was quite a lot of racism, sexism and homophobia within this group. With his findings, Willis not only rejects the arguments of functionalists such as Parsons and Durkheim. Parsons, remember, believed schools were meritocratic, and Durkheim believed that, schools were good for secondary socialisation. But he also disagrees with the Marxists like Bowles and Gintis. Firstly, he concluded that school was not an agent of socialisation and there were no shared values, as functionalists argued. And he said that this because the lads rejected the values of the school and the teachers and did not take them seriously. So clearly they do not share values. They did not end up with the same values as everyone else. So therefore not everyone's getting the value consensus, which challenges the functionalist view. In addition, they were not hard-working or obedient workers like Bowles and Gintis suggested. Wrong way. Instead, they rebelled against the teachers and the ear rolls. So you're not getting this docile workforce from these boys. So clearly the correspondence theory wasn't happening. Yet, the outcome was the same. This is what's interesting. The working class boys did go on to do working class jobs. And ultimately it did benefit capitalism. And this is because capitalism just needs students to fail so that they accept that they have to do the low-paid work that no one else does. And this is why Willis is a Marxist, okay? He recognises that those boys did not share the value consensus. They did not get brainwashed to accept meritocracy, but yet they still failed, and that still ultimately benefits capitalism. Well, I've highlighted that bit on my version if you can do it in yours. So in this study, the lads thought school was boring and pointless and something they had to survive until they could go to work. And they described school as being for messing about and having a laugh. The lads did this because they believed they would end up in factory jobs like their dads, so they didn't bother trying in school. And they created anti-school subcultures. So that's really important. It wasn't because of labelling, it wasn't because of setting or streaming. They believed they were always going to do factory jobs like their dads, and they never thought school was going to help them do anything different. So the boys didn't do this because of labelling, but instead they did it because they never believed in that myth of meritocracy in the school system. They didn't believe working class boys could do well at school, so they never believed they could do well, and they believed they would end up in factories like their fathers. And instead, they chose to reject school and enjoy themselves. So quite an interesting study, this one, because instead of kind of all having to go along and be brainwashed by schools, he seems to think that these boys actually had some free will and they made the choice to fail, which is really interesting. So please pause the lecture at this point and answer those 4 questions that I ran through at the beginning with you, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I just want to have a last look with you at an exam question, and I have looked at this question in previous lectures before, but I want us to think about how we could use maybe a point on setting and streaming to help answer this question. So schools reward ability. Those who are clever and work hard achieve the best results in school. Do you agree with this view? Now, firstly, when you look at this question, the idea that schools reward ability and if you work hard, you'll get the best results, this is asking you about, are schools a meritocracy? Are they meritocratic? So you do need to make some reference to that concept in your answer. So how do we use setting and streaming to help us answer that? So if we know that students are put into sets, and if they're put in, why are they being put into sets according to Hargreaves and Ball? What are the reasons they're being put into sets? Is it because of ability or is it because of class? And hopefully after watching this lecture, you recognise that Ball and Hargreaves believe they've been put into those sets or bands or streams not because of their natural ability, but because of their social class, because of the labels they've been given. So I've given you a point to start off with. You don't have to use my one, but I'd like you to use something similar to it. Schools don't always reward the most clever, as many put working class students in bottom sets, even though they might be able. You then need to explain this with detail and an example. So students put teachers into sets based on, you tell me, you give me some detail, you tell me what Hargreaves said, you tell me what Ball said. And then the effect of this is, you tell me a bit more about this point. What happens because they've been put into bottom set? What's the effect of that? I've given you some concepts there to use, like middle class, working class, labelling, self-fulfilling prophecy or SFP, subcultures, status, deviance, studies like Ball, Hargreaves, maybe Willis. I'm not 100% about Willis in this one, but possibly. And then this is important. Make sure you link the paragraph back to the question. This means that schools are not rewarding ability because explain how your argument answers that question. So have a go at writing that paragraph out in full. Once you've done that, and if you've still got a bit of time, What other 2 points could you write to fully answer this essay? You might have already written 1 or 2 points for this in a previous lesson with me or lecture, so you could just add to that one. But in a 15-mark essay, you do need to write 3 detailed paragraphs to respond to the question. And for a question like this, 1 point should definitely agree with the question. So try and think which point or which theory, I'll give you a hint, which theory, Marxism or functionalism, would agree with the question that schools do reward ability. And then you'll need another point as well. And if you still have time, have a go at doing your conclusion, which again, you need a conclusion for 15-mark essays on the Eduqas spec. What would your conclusion include? Which would you judge is the strongest argument you've made? And that depends on the other 2 points you did. Which of the 2 do you think is the strongest? And if you're going to do a good conclusion, you've got to explain why it's stronger, perhaps, than the other arguments that you've made. Thanks so much for listening. And do let me know if you would like access to the worksheet and you haven't been able to see it as part of this lecture.